Hey, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the importance of African American swing bands to the broader African American community in the 1930s and 40s. We're also going to talk about some of the diversity of African American experience at this time. We're going to do it by looking at two of the great swing bands of the time, Count Basie's band and Duke Ellington's band, the differing backgrounds of the band leaders, and some of the differences that brought about in the sound of their music. So let's get into this. It's hard to overestimate the importance of swing bands, African American swing bands, to the broader African American community in the 1930s and 40s. During a time of economic hardship, of segregation, later on during restrictions that were placed on all Americans during World War II, famous swing bands like Duke Ellington's or Count Basie's were traveling representatives of Black culture. These were bands that were famous and beloved, and not simply beloved by the African American community, but beloved by tens of millions of white Americans also. They were famous. They were respected. Just look at this concert poster for Duke Ellington, the in-person genius of jazz. There were so few areas of American life that were willing to grant genius status to African Americans in any regard of life. And yet these men were famous, they were respected, they were viewed as talented. A really underappreciated thing to understand would be the mobility, the freedom that these men had. These were Black men that were able to travel the country at a time in which traveling while Black was a very precarious thing for most African Americans. African Americans were most vulnerable when they were away from people that knew them, both people within the African American community and white friends and acquaintances that they had. If you were accused of doing something wrong, illegal, hell, looking at a white woman the wrong way when you were Black, if it happened in your hometown or your community, there were people that would be willing to stand up for you. Both people, again, in the African American community, and maybe even white folk in your community that might be willing to stand up and vouch for you, that would serve as protection and safety. But once you were outside of that, it was a really frightening prospect for African Americans. And so one of the things that was amazing about these swing bands is that they would travel around the country and be able to do so relatively freely. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean Black musicians did not run into trouble when they were on the road. They did sometimes, in fact. Let me play you something from Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy Gillespie, we'll talk about Gillespie like Charlie Parker more when we talk about bebop. But like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie got his start in the swing era. Later on, he would form his own bands, and later on, he would become very interested in Afro-Cuban sounds. And this is a song called Manteca that he did. This is a live version of the song. I want you to listen to the beginning of it, and then I'll explain a little bit of it in a second.
I never go back to Georgia. I never go back to Georgia. What? I never go back to Georgia.
Good song. I'll put it in the weekly module for you guys because it's a good song. But if you couldn't make out what they were saying, is the guys in the band to the rhythm of the song were saying, "I'll never go back to Georgia. I'll never go back to Georgia. I'll never go back to Georgia." The context of that is the band was touring and they were in Georgia and they got hassled by law enforcement and some whites in that state. And now they're saying, like, we're never going to go back to Georgia. So when I say, and when Ehrenberg talks in the book, writes in the book, that these swing bands traveled around the United States freely, that's not to say they didn't run into problems, but they did it in a much more bold way than the typical African American in the 1930s and 40s would have been willing to just go around the United States. It was one of the things that African Americans at the time kind of marveled at. Look at how these guys get to just go around the United States and travel around. Eventually, also internationally, and they would go internationally with their music. These musicians also, some of them attained more wealth than others. Duke Ellington would be a good example. Count Basie would be examples of people that made a lot of money while they were doing this. Now, not all the musicians and not all the side musicians did, but at the very least, there was the facade of wealth for some of them. They dressed nice. Their uniforms were beautiful. Their stage shows could be elaborate. There was projections of sophistication that came from this. And so Ehrenberg writes about the way in which this was such a source of pride for the African American community. These were traveling representatives of black culture, and they were respected by both white and black audiences in the United States. And Ehrenberg also writes beautifully about the way in which the African American community would come together and support these bands. One of the perennial problems of black entertainers touring in the United States was finding accommodations. Now, in places, larger cities like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, there were hotels that catered to African Americans where they could find accommodations because so many places, hotels were segregated and would not allow black musicians to stay, both in the North and the South. We tend to think of segregation as a problem of the American South, but New York City, Chicago, every big city in the United States had segregated hotels that were white only. The difference between the South and the North often was how explicit or subtle this segregation was. So, hotels in the South were just explicit about it. There'd be signs out front and within making it clear that African Americans were not allowed to stay in these places. Big hotels in New York, small hotels in New York, might not have a sign in the front of it that says no African Americans welcome. But let a black person go into that hotel and try to get a room for the night, and they would be told, "Oh, I'm sorry, all our rooms are booked." And then they would watch as a white patron would come in and ask for a room and be given a room. Okay, so the segregation of the North could just be more subtle than it was in the South. But big cities did tend to have places, hotels that would cater to African Americans. In New York City, there were places in Harlem in particular that had places to stay. Along Central Avenue in Los Angeles, there were places for African Americans to stay. But in other places, these swing bands didn't just play large cities. They played mid-sized, moderate-sized cities in areas that didn't have hotels that catered to African Americans. So in those cases, members of the African American community, knowing these bands were coming to town, would often get together and try to make arrangements and accommodations for these bands to be able to spend the night. People would take these musicians into their home and provide them with a place to stay, knowing that there are no hotels in our community for these people, so we'll just divvy it up. People would volunteer. I got room in my place to take two of the gentlemen, and so two of the musicians would be told after the show, "You're going to follow me home, and you're going to stay at our place." People that didn't have maybe space to stay might provide food. Once again, knowing that, especially late at night after these shows were often done, that either restaurants are closed, or specifically restaurants that catered to African Americans would be closed. So maybe people would provide food and bring food for the band afterwards. And people happily did this because, once again, they were so proud of these musicians, these representatives of Black culture. And so pay attention to what Ehrenberg has to say about the way in which swing bands, Black swing bands, served as a source of pride for the African American community, and the way in which the African American community would reach out and do their best to support these bands. Let's talk about some of the differences in this. For so many white Americans, the African American community is viewed as a monolith. But like all Americans, there is diversity in experience. And Ehrenberg tries to highlight this by talking about the differences between Duke Ellington's band and Count Basie's band, both in the background of the band leaders and in differences in the sound of their music. Duke Ellington came from the Black middle class. He grew up in Washington, D.C. His father was a very in-demand butler. In fact, his father served in the White House for a number of years. His mother was a teacher. Ellington grew up in a Black middle-class neighborhood. In a lot of big cities in the United States, there were upscale and middle-class Black neighborhoods for those African Americans who had reached middle class or wealthy status. In Los Angeles, it was the West Adams district near USC today. That was the West Adams district, was where you lived if you were Black and had some money in Southern California. That was the one area that wasn't redlined to the point where you could buy a really beautiful home in that neighborhood. That's where you were relegated to. But if you just drove around that neighborhood and didn't see anybody, it just looked like a very nice middle class, upper middle class neighborhood until you started seeing people coming in and out of these homes, and they were all African American. Duke Ellington grew up in one of these neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. He had very good access to education. His mother was a teacher. He received very good musical training, both in classical music, and then took that approach to jazz music as he got older. He had opportunities to go to college if he wanted to go. But music was his thing, and so after graduating from high school, Ellington headed up to New York City. Now, in our last lecture, we had talked about how in the teens and early 20s, Chicago was the center of the jazz world. But as we get to the later into the 20s and into the 30s, the jazz world migrated to New York City, and New York City became the center of American jazz culture. And so Ellington left Washington, D.C. and headed up to New York City, specifically Harlem, although the name of the first band he was in that he formed was the Washingtonians, so it gave some, it was a nod to his hometown. But we tend to associate Duke Ellington and his sound with his adopted city of New York City. That's when we think of Duke Ellington, that's what we think of. We think of New York City. And Ellington arrived during the Harlem Renaissance. Now, when I studied the Harlem Renaissance in high school and in college, I mostly remember being taught about literature and poetry and theater. But a really vital aspect of the Harlem Renaissance was music, and Duke Ellington himself was a key part of this. Into the late teens through the 1930s, Harlem served as a kind of mecca, a destination for talented African Americans from all around the United States, because Harlem seemed like one of the places, if you were talented and black, you could go to where your talent would best be recognized, where you could best try to fulfill your talent. So Harlem, particularly in the 20s, became this magnet for writers and playwrights and, yes, musicians, people like Duke Ellington. And so much of his music we associate with New York City. There was his popular music. Ellington had so many layers to his music. So I think I already played this for you. But Ellington's most famous commercially popular song from the swing era was Take the A Train. Just a great swing song, flowing and free, hooking melody. You hear this and you're humming this melody for the rest of the day. You know, Ellington could write and perform pop songs, dance songs with the best of them. You see this example of everybody performing the music like it's written on the stage. And then we start getting that improvising that we associate with jazz. Sorry, I accidentally paused the recording when I meant to pause the song. But Ellington could also write, and did write, very sophisticated, complex, subtle music. Let's listen to another song. Interestingly, both of these songs are about New York City. Take the A Train. The A Train is one of the subway trains lines in New York City. And here's a song called Echoes of Harlem. This is a subtle song. This is a minimalist song. This is not a dance song. This is not a song with a hooky melody. It's a great song, but it's not a pop song. And Ellington never thought of himself simply as a jazz musician. I have a YouTube video on there, just a short, it's less than a minute, of Duke Ellington talking about his music, and he talks about dreaming. And the interviewer tells him, "I thought you were a piano player," and he says, "No. This isn't." And he starts playing the piano, and he says, "This isn't piano. This is dreaming." Right? And so Ellington had this very broad range of music that he played. And Ellington hoped for his music to be thought of in terms of being as great as European classical music. Unlike Paul Whiteman, who believed that jazz was inferior and needed to be blended with European symphonic traditions, Ellington thought he was creating music that was as great as that music, but didn't feel like it needed that, European classical symphonic tradition to it. Ellington had very good musical training. Ellington, like Duke Ellington, like Benny Goodman, could play classical music as well as he could play jazz when called upon. Now, Ehrenberg in your chapter talks about Ellington's background and his experiences coming from an idea known as Ellington's background fits into the profile of what was known as the talented tenth. The talented tenth is this idea that came from the writer W.E.B. Du Bois, who at the beginning of the 20th century talked about the need for African Americans to excel in many different areas and to demonstrate their proficiency in the arts, in the sciences, in the humanities. That there need to be these black representatives to show what, when given the opportunity, what African Americans could achieve. So there was this, this vague idea that there was roughly 10% of the black population who had emerged out of poverty and who had moved into middle class status and had greater access to education, people like Ellington's family. And that 10% had an important obligation to the other 90% of the African American community that hadn't been able to work their way out of poverty. That this talented 10% had a tremendous responsibility to demonstrate to white America what African Americans could achieve if only given the opportunity. Some of the aspirational quality of Ellington's music, the greatness he desired with his music, some have argued was part of this project of demonstrating what in general Black America could accomplish if given the opportunity. All right. And so Ellington's music has sometimes been described as a reflection of the aspirations of the talented tenth, that there was a responsibility there, that his music reflected the sound and the sophistication of the educated African American community. Yeah. Now let's talk about Count Basie, because Basie came from that other 90% of the African American experience. And by the way, this 10%, 90% stuff these weren't precise numbers. These were more a sort of general notion. Basie grew up in New Jersey, near Newark, New Jersey. He grew up with less resources than Ellington. Whereas Ellington could have gone on to college if he had wanted to, Basie dropped out of school right after junior high. By the time he was done with junior high, he realized what he wanted to do with his life, and what he wanted to do with his life was music. And so therefore, high school didn't serve any purpose in his life. Basie had musical lessons. He was taught piano, although his first love was actually drums. There was another drummer in the neighborhood that was way better than him. And so around the age of 15, that convinced him to focus on playing the piano, because he realized he was never going to be better than this other drummer that was nearby. But Basie did not have the same level of musical training that Duke Ellington had. Okay, Basie learned more, rather than in terms of theory and in terms of written music. Basie learned more by ear. Basie learned more in terms of interaction with other people, being taught person to person, rather than in composition and theory like Duke Ellington learned. In fact, throughout his career, Basie was never super comfortable writing out his compositions and his things, and often had members of his band help write things out for the other musicians in the band because of his level of training. As a young man, he started to tour the country with various acts, eventually getting stranded in Kansas City. He was playing with a band that was a smaller level band that was making enough money to go from show to show. So the receipts from the previous night's show paid for the buses, the food, and the hotels for the next show. Well, the receipts, the money from the previous night's show got stolen, and so the band was stranded. Basically, the band broke up in Kansas City. And Kansas City had been developing this interesting, unique sound. It wasn't the sound of New York City. It wasn't the sound of Chicago or New Orleans. They had their own thing that was going on. And Basie stuck around. He kind of liked what was going on there, and eventually formed his own band in Kansas City and would be discovered there. Eventually he would move to Chicago, but like if Duke Ellington is always associated with New York City and the sophistication of New York City, Count Basie is always associated with Kansas City. Unlike New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago, Kansas City, Missouri didn't really develop a significant black middle class. Missouri was so segregated. There were so many obstacles thrown up in front of African Americans. It was very difficult for anybody from the African American community to attain middle class status, because it was just so segregated an environment. And so whereas in New York City, Duke Ellington played for sophisticated white audiences and for members of the black middle class, along with working class and poor African Americans that also loved his music, Basie largely played to black audiences from the working class. And because of that, these audiences often wanted dance music. They wanted pop music. You know, that Echoes of Harlem sound that I was playing before. If you played this in a dance club in Kansas City to a working class black audience, you were probably going to get booed off of stage, because they weren't about that. The more sophisticated New York City audiences that weren't necessarily always there to dance, but to listen to sophisticated music, Ellington could play that there. And so one of the things that Ehrenberg talks about is how Basie's music reflected more of that Kansas City scene. More dance music, more rhythm and blues in terms of its musical background, more of the blues, more of a boogie woogie sound that was emanating from from Kansas City. More improvisational. Let's listen to Count Basie's song. This is one of his songs. It's called 1 O'Clock Jump. Basie had written the song with some of the guys in the band, and they were going to perform it on a late night radio show live. And it occurred right before they were about to go perform, right before they were about to play the song. It occurred to Count Basie that he didn't give a name to the song. He hadn't titled the song yet. And so he just looked up at the clock, and it was almost 1 o'clock in the morning. And so he just called the song 1 O'Clock Jump. And this is it. Notice that boogie woogie beat to the song, right? Very bluesy in terms of it. Just great rhythm to the song. Like you just hear this and your body just starts moving. You'll notice that the song is also largely a platform for improvisation. Right from the beginning, both Ellington and Basie were piano players. And so you hear Basie just right from the get-go started improvising the piano. Then the saxophone, improvisation. Basie's songs were written on 12-bar blues structures more straightforwardly, and often had a riff to begin the song. Here comes the trombone solo now, and then more of a platform for improvisation and soloing. And that's what most of this song is, as it just builds. And you notice this song, there's the trumpet. The song starts kind of quiet with the piano, but as the song goes on, it starts to build. I remember reading it once, and it always has stayed with me ever since because it's so fitting that somebody once described Basie's music like a freight train going down the tracks, like starting slowly but powerfully building as it went. And this is a great example of that, where the song starts a little slow and then just starts building, and then it just, by the end of the song, it's just this unstoppable force. It's a great song. All right? It's a dance song. It's a pop song. It's filled with improvisation, virtuosity as you get with it. Not complex harmonies, not subtlety, right? It's this really great bluesy improvisational platform that allows all these great soloists in Basie's band to really stand up and shine. And so the sound of Ellington's and Basie's music reflect aspects of their differing backgrounds and the part of the African American community that these guys came from. Basie's music tended to be more blues, more improvisational. A swing band is broken up into three parts when we talk about swing bands. There's the brass section, that's the trumpets and the trombones. There's the reed section, that's the clarinets and the saxophones. And then there's the rhythm section, which is everything else. The drums, the bass, the guitar, and the piano. Each swing band tended to have their segment that they highlighted maybe a little bit more, or was the part of their band that was the best. Think of it like with a sports team, like a football team. Some football teams are better at defense, some are better at offense, some have great special teams. You want all of them to be great, but usually there's one that a band does a little better than the other. Basie's bands were always famous for that great rhythm section. That's part of what gave that, that freight train feel, that just unstoppable force to the band. Ellington's music tended to be more sophisticated, more harmonically complex, sometimes more minimalist, more subtle. He didn't always write songs that were poppy or danceable, but songs that required more discipline from the person listening to the music. And this reflects some of his own musical background and musical training, and maybe some of this aspiration of the talented tenth, of the educated black middle class. It's a really interesting chapter that Ellington, or that Ehrenberg writes about the differences between these two men's music. Both fantastic. You don't want to live in a world where you don't have both of them, but they're great in different ways. And it highlights strengths of different parts of the African American community, because that's where they both drew their inspirations from. All right, that's it for this lecture. I'll talk to you guys next time.